Late one night, Ethan Carter is pulled over by the police on his way home from work. What starts as a routine stop quickly spirals into a nightmare when officers claim to find a bag of cash and a gun in his trunk. Items Ethan swears he's never seen before. Accused of a crime he didn't commit and framed by corrupt cops, Ethan is thrown into a broken justice system with no way out. With the evidence stacked against him and his life falling apart, Ethan's fight for the truth seems impossible. But in his darkest moments, unexpected acts of kindness from strangers begin to light the way. As allies emerge and the cracks in the case grow wider, Ethan discovers a strength he didn't know he had. Will he prove his innocence and expose the corruption threatening to destroy him? Or will the lies bury him for good? Ethan Carter sat slumped in his driver's seat, one hand gripping the steering wheel, the other fumbling with the volume on his old car radio. Static. He sighed and turned it off completely. The only sound now was the low hum of the engine as he drove through empty streets. It was late 9:47 p.m., according to the faint blue numbers on his dashboard. He had just left his office after another grueling 12-hour day, his work bag tossed carelessly onto the passenger seat. Ethan was the kind of man most people overlooked. At 30, he was neither extraordinary nor particularly invisible. He worked in accounts for a corporate firm in the city, the kind of job that demanded long hours, but never much recognition. He rented a small one-bedroom apartment on the edge of town, a space clean but bare. The walls were plain, save for a crooked picture of a sailboat his mother had given him years ago. Tonight, he was exhausted. His body ached, and his thoughts drifted like leaves in a windless room. All he wanted was to collapse on his worn-out couch, maybe eat whatever leftovers were waiting in his fridge, and fall asleep to mindless TV noise. Life had become a monotonous pattern for Ethan. Work, home, repeat. As he approached a dark stretch of road, he noticed the streetlights flickering, barely holding on. Like him. The city had forgotten this part of town. Ethan rolled his shoulders, trying to shake off the unease settling over him. The night was eerily quiet. No cars, no pedestrians, just an unsettling stillness that clung to everything like fog. Suddenly, headlights appeared in his rearview mirror. Ethan barely paid them any attention at first. Lots of people sped through these forgotten roads at night. But then the lights got closer, brighter, uncomfortably close. Before he could react, red and blue flashed, cutting through the darkness like a warning bell. Ethan's heart jumped. He muttered under his breath, pulling over to the side of the road. What did I do? He thought, his mind racing. Did I miss a stop sign? Was I speeding? He was careful about things like that. Ethan prided himself on his spotless record. As he rolled down the window, he placed his hands on the wheel, just like he had seen people do in movies. The officers approached two men. The first one, Detective Robert Hale, leaned into the window with a flashlight aimed directly at Ethan's face. The light burned his eyes. Hale was tall, sharp-featured, and carried an air of authority that made Ethan nervous. Behind him was Officer Sam Norris, broad and muscular, but with a strange lightness to his movements. "Evening, sir. License and registration," Hale barked, his voice edged with impatience. Ethan fumbled to retrieve his wallet and the car's papers. "Good evening, officer. Did I do something wrong?" He kept his tone calm and polite, even though his pulse was quickening. "Yeah," Hale replied vaguely, taking Ethan's license and glancing at it. He said nothing else. Instead, he tilted his head back toward Norris, who had started circling Ethan's car like a predator sizing up its prey. Ethan watched him in the rearview mirror, a sinking feeling pooling in his stomach. Something felt wrong. "I don't understand," Ethan started to say, but Hale cut him off. "Just sit tight." Ethan gripped the wheel, forcing himself to breathe evenly. The officer had no reason to harass him, right? His car was clean. He was clean. This had to be some mistake. Then it happened. Norris walked to the trunk, looked around as if making sure no one else was watching, and then click. Ethan heard the trunk latch pop open. "Wait, what are you doing?" Ethan shouted, his voice panicked now. "You can't open my trunk without asking." Neither officer responded. Hale grabbed Ethan's arm, jerking him roughly out of the car. "Hey, I have rights," Ethan protested, his voice rising. But the cold pavement was already beneath his feet, his breath visible in the night air. He turned just in time to see Officer Norris pull a backpack from the trunk, one Ethan had never seen before in his life. "Well, well, well. What do we have here?" Norris said, holding the bag like it was some kind of prize. Ethan froze. The world tilted sideways as Hale yanked his hands behind his back and cuffed him. "What is this?" Ethan stammered. "That is not mine. I swear." Hale smirked, the flashlight still in Ethan's face. "We will figure that out back at the station," he said coldly. Panic swelled in Ethan's chest. He tried to twist around, to face them, but the cuffs dug into his wrists. "You are making a mistake. That is not my bag." His voice cracked as desperation flooded in. "Sure, buddy," Norris muttered with a chuckle. "That is what they all say." Ethan's protests fell on deaf ears. The officers shoved him into the back of the police cruiser. The smell inside was sharp and stale, like sweat and old fear. As they drove, the two men joked up front, their voices low but loud enough for Ethan to hear. "Think he will crack in the first hour?" Norris asked, his tone casual. "Guys like him always do," Hale replied, laughing. Ethan stared at the steel cage separating him from the front seats. "Guys like me?" What did that even mean? Tears burned at the back of his eyes, but he blinked them away. This could not be happening. This kind of thing happened to other people, not to him. He thought about his mother, who would have been asleep by now in her small house across town. What would she think when she found out? The ride to the station felt like an eternity. The city lights blurred outside the windows, and Ethan's mind raced, trying to piece together what had happened. How had his life flipped upside down in a matter of minutes? When they finally arrived at the station, Hale and Norris dragged him into a small, cold interrogation room. The metal table was scratched, and the fluorescent light overhead flickered like something out of a horror movie. Ethan slumped into the chair, his cuffed hands resting awkwardly on the table. Hale leaned over him, his expression unreadable. "Why do you not save us some time, Ethan? Tell us what you were doing near the bank tonight." Ethan's confusion turned to anger. "I was at work. Check with my boss. Check the cameras." Hale exchanged a glance with Norris, who smirked. "Funny thing," Norris said. "Your fingerprints are all over that gun in the bag." Ethan's blood ran cold. "That is impossible. You are lying." Hale slammed his hand on the table, making Ethan jump. "Watch your tone, kid. You are not in a position to call anyone a liar." Hours dragged by as they grilled him. The accusations were relentless, their voices a constant storm, twisting his words against him. Ethan stayed strong, repeating the same thing over and over. "It is not mine. I was at work." By the time they finally tossed him into a holding cell, it was well past midnight. Ethan slumped onto the cold metal bench, his head in his hands. The cell stank of sweat and regret, and a man in the corner hummed some off-key tune that grated on Ethan's nerves. He stared at the cement wall, his mind a whirl of fear and disbelief. How could this happen? Who would believe him now? His record was spotless, his life quiet until now. As the heavy cell door slammed shut, Ethan muttered to himself, his voice a mere whisper in the dark. "All right, Ethan. You need to figure out how the hell you are going to get out of this mess." But deep down, he was terrified. For the first time in his life, he realized no one was coming to save him. Ethan Carter sat slouched on the cold metal bench in the holding cell, his head buried in his hands. The distant hum of voices and the occasional clanging of doors echoed through the station. But to him, it all blended into a hollow, muffled noise. His chest felt tight, like someone had reached inside him and squeezed out all the air. He kept replaying the events in his head, every moment etched sharply in his memory. The red and blue lights, the look on Officer Norris's face when he pulled that bag from the trunk, the way Detective Hale had smirked at him, like it was all some big game. "This cannot be happening," Ethan muttered to himself, his voice low and hoarse. He rubbed his wrists, still red from the cuffs. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw his mother's face, her worried expression, as she turned on the morning news and saw his name plastered under a mugshot. The thought sent a fresh wave of nausea rolling through him. The hummer in the corner of the cell finally stopped, his voice replaced by a low chuckle. "First time in here, huh?" the man said, his voice gravelly, like he had been smoking for years. Ethan looked up, eyes bleary. The man sat with his back against the wall, his legs stretched out like he had all the time in the world. He was older, maybe in his 60s, with a shock of white hair and a beard that had seen better days. His faded denim jacket hung off his thin frame. "Yeah," Ethan replied, his voice flat. The man nodded knowingly. "You look like you do not belong here. What did they say you did?" Ethan hesitated, his throat tight. "They think I robbed a bank." The man raised his eyebrows, a ghost of a smile tugging at his lips. "You? A bank robber? You look about as threatening as a house cat." Despite himself, Ethan snorted a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sigh. "Tell that to the cops," he said, bitterness coating his words. The man tilted his head, studying Ethan. "They set you up." It was not a question. It was a statement. Ethan blinked. "How do you know that?" "Kid, I've been in and out of this place more times than I can count," the man replied. "You get good at reading people, and you are too scared to be guilty." He shrugged. "The system's a mess, son. Sometimes the truth is the last thing anyone cares about." Ethan swallowed hard, the truth of the words settling like stones in his gut. He leaned back against the cold wall and stared at the ceiling. "What am I supposed to do now?" The older man sighed and scratched his beard. "You hold on to your truth no matter what. People like them, those cops, they feed off fear. You give up, they win. Do not let them take that from you." Ethan stared at him for a moment, unsure how to respond. The man's words were strangely comforting, like a small light in a tunnel that felt endless. "What's your name?" Ethan asked finally. "George," the man said. "George Harris. And you?" "Ethan," he replied. "Well, Ethan," George said with a small nod, "I hope you have someone out there who believes you." Ethan let the words sink in. Someone who believes you. The thought made him ache. Did he have anyone? His mother, maybe, though she had been distant since his father passed. Friends. Most of them were just colleagues who would not think twice about the headlines. It struck him then just how alone he really was. The next morning came too soon. Ethan had not slept. The narrow cot in the corner of the cell offered little comfort, and every time he closed his eyes, the weight of his situation pressed down on him. By the time the guard came to yank open the cell door, he felt like a hollowed-out version of himself. "Carter! Let's go!" the guard barked. Ethan stumbled to his feet, his legs stiff, and followed the guard out of the cell. As they walked down the hall, the smell of stale coffee and disinfectant filled the air. Every set of eyes officer, other inmates seemed to linger on him. Judging, he was led into a small, windowless room where his court-appointed lawyer sat at a table, flipping through a thin stack of papers. Ethan's heart sank. The man looked like he had not had a good night's sleep in years. His tie was crooked, and he barely looked up as Ethan sat down across from him. "Ethan Carter," the man muttered, running a hand through thinning hair. "I'm Michael Brooks. I will be representing you." Ethan nodded weakly. "Thank you." Michael waved off the gratitude with a sigh. "Listen, Ethan, I am going to be straight with you. This is not looking good." Ethan's stomach tightened. "I did not do this," he said firmly. "That bag, they planted it. I was at work all night. There are cameras. My boss can vouch for me." Michael finally looked at him, his expression unreadable. "I hear you," But we have a problem. The officers are claiming your fingerprints were found on the gun in that bag, and the prosecution is going to use that against you. Ethan's mind reeled. How? That is impossible. I have never touched a gun in my life. Michael held up a hand to calm him. I believe you, but right now, believing you is not enough. We need proof. You say you were at work? Yes, Ethan replied desperately. Please, you can check the cameras. Call my boss. Michael scribbled something in his notebook and nodded. All right, I will look into it. But you need to be prepared. This is going to take time. Time? Ethan asked, his voice rising. I do not have time. My life is falling apart right now. You have to help me. Michael sighed again, clearly worn down. I will do what I can, but you need to stay calm. Ethan slumped back in his chair, frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. Stay calm. Easy for him to say. He was not the one being framed. That afternoon, Ethan was led back to the holding cell, his heart heavier than before. He sat back on the cold bench and dropped his head into his hands. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, mocking him. He felt trapped, helpless, and completely invisible. Rough day? George's voice broke through the silence. Ethan lifted his head and managed a bitter laugh. You could say that. George nodded thoughtfully. Let me tell you something, kid. There are two kinds of people in this world. The ones who sink when life throws them overboard, and the ones who swim even when the current is against them. Ethan looked at him, confused. What does that mean? It means you keep fighting, George said firmly. No matter how bad it looks, you fight for the truth, and you fight for yourself. People will surprise you. Sometimes, the ones you least expect will throw you a life raft. Ethan stared at him, the words hanging in the air like something precious. For the first time in hours, he felt a flicker of hope, a small ember buried deep inside him. Maybe George was right. Maybe there was a way out of this. As the cell door clanged shut for the night, Ethan leaned back against the wall, breathing deeply. His world was crumbling, but he was not ready to give up yet. And somewhere deep down, he hoped someone out there was ready to believe in him. Ethan woke with a start, the sound of metal clanging against metal dragging him out of a restless sleep. His neck ached from the awkward angle at which he had slumped against the cold cement wall. The cell was still dim, only a sliver of light filtering through the narrow window high above. For a moment, disoriented, he forgot where he was. Then the memories hit him like a punch to the gut. The flashing red and blue lights, the planted bag, Detective Hale's smug face. Sighing, Ethan rubbed his eyes and ran a hand through his disheveled hair. He had not seen a mirror since his arrest, but he could feel the weight of exhaustion in his bones. The previous day had been endless interrogations, accusations, and Michael Brooks, his court-appointed lawyer, offering half-hearted promises that felt more like warnings. You still breathing over there? George's voice broke through the silence. Ethan glanced at the older man across the cell. George sat up against the wall, legs crossed, a lazy grin tugging at his lips. Despite the circumstances, there was an odd calmness to him. Barely, Ethan replied, his voice hoarse. George let out a low chuckle. It's always darkest before dawn, kid. You hang in there. Ethan offered a weak nod, though he felt far from hopeful. His mind was a jumbled mess. Every time he thought about that bag or the gun they claimed had his fingerprints, his chest tightened with frustration. It was impossible. It had to be. But how could he prove it? The sound of heavy footsteps approached. A guard unlocked the cell and barked, "Carter, you're up. Let's move." Ethan's stomach churned. "Where are we going?" "Court," the guard replied curtly. "Preliminary hearing." Ethan's throat went dry. This was moving faster than he expected. He rose to his feet, legs unsteady, and shot George a glance. The older man gave him a small, reassuring nod. "Keep your chin up," George said softly as Ethan stepped through the open door. "The fight's just getting started." The courtroom was smaller than Ethan imagined, yet it still felt enormous as he walked in, flanked by a guard. Rows of pew-like benches lined the room, mostly empty, except for a few faces he did not recognize. Reporters, probably, waiting to spin his story into a sensational headline. At the front of the room sat the judge, a stern-looking woman with short gray hair and thin-rimmed glasses that gave her an air of sharp intelligence. Michael Brooks was already at the defense table, a mess of papers spread in front of him. He looked up as Ethan approached and gave him a quick nod. "Sit down and let me do the talking." Ethan sank into the hard chair, his palms clammy. Across the room he spotted Detective Hale and Officer Norris sitting stiff-backed behind the prosecutor. Hale caught Ethan's eye and offered the faintest smirk, a silent taunt that made Ethan's blood boil. The hearing began quickly. The prosecutor, a polished woman in a Navy suit, wasted no time painting Ethan as a dangerous criminal. She laid out the charges with clinical precision: possession of stolen property, illegal possession of a firearm, suspicion of armed robbery. Ethan could barely process the words. Each one landed like a blow. Michael stood and gave a weak counterargument, pointing out Ethan's clean record and stable employment. But his voice lacked conviction, and even Ethan could tell he was out of his depth. The prosecutor fired back effortlessly, citing the planted evidence and emphasizing the fingerprints on the gun. Ethan clenched his fists under the table, biting the inside of his cheek to keep from shouting. "This is all lies," he wanted to scream. But no one would listen. The truth, it seemed, was drowning under the weight of manufactured evidence. The judge listened carefully, her expression unreadable, before speaking. "Given the severity of the charges and the presented evidence, I'm setting bail at $50,000. Ethan's heart dropped. $50,000. He might as well have been asked to buy the moon. The gavel struck the sound block, the sharp crack echoing in his ears, as though it marked the end of his life. Back in the holding area, Ethan sat with his head in his hands, his thoughts a storm of anger, fear, and helplessness. He could hear the other inmates talking, laughing, some shouting across the hall, but it all blurred into background noise. Michael Brooks shuffled into the room and dropped into the chair across from him. He looked frazzled, like someone who had been fighting a losing battle for too long. "I'm sorry, Ethan," Michael said, rubbing his temples. "The prosecutor's got a strong case. That evidence—" "The evidence is fake," Ethan snapped, his voice cracking. "Why don't you believe me?" Michael sighed, his tone softer. "It's not about whether I believe you. It's about what we can prove. You say you were at work the night of the robbery. I'm going to look into that. Surveillance footage, witnesses, anything that can confirm your alibi. But it'll take time." Ethan let out a bitter laugh. "Time. Do you realize what's happening to me? My life is falling apart while you're saying it'll take time." Michael raised a hand to calm him, though his face betrayed a flicker of guilt. "I'm doing the best I can, Ethan. You need to trust me." Ethan slumped back in his chair, the fight draining out of him. Trust. He was not sure he trusted anyone anymore. Later that night, Ethan was returned to the cell, his shoulders sagging. George was still there, sitting in his usual spot against the wall. He glanced up as Ethan entered, his eyes sharp and observant. "How'd it goes?" George asked quietly. Ethan didn't answer right away. He sat down on the bench and stared at the floor, his voice low when he finally spoke. "They set my bail at $50,000. I can't afford that." George let out a low whistle. "That's rough. I'm sorry, kid." Ethan rubbed his hands over his face, trying to keep his emotions in check. "I don't know what to do," he admitted. "They have everything stacked against me. My lawyer says he's looking into my alibi, but what if it's not enough? What if no one believes me?" George was silent for a moment before speaking. "You hold on. You fight, even when it feels like you're swinging at shadows. Because giving up? That's what they want. People like those cops, Hale, was it? They get off on breaking people. Do not let them break you." Ethan looked up, surprised by the intensity in George's voice. "Why do you care?" George shrugged. "Because I've been there. Not the same, maybe, but close enough. And sometimes, a little kindness is all it takes to get through the worst of it." Ethan stared at him, the words settling over him like a blanket he hadn't realized he needed. That night, as Ethan lay on the hard cot, George's words echoed in his mind. Hold on. He replayed every detail of the arrest, every word, every glance, looking for something, anything that might help. They have to have made a mistake, he whispered to himself. There's got to be a way to prove it. Sleep didn't come easy, but as he drifted off, Ethan clung to a small ember of determination. He would not let them win. He would not let himself be broken. Somewhere, somehow, the truth would come out. It had to. The days began to blur for Ethan Carter. He had no watch, no clock to tell him how long he had been sitting in that dim holding cell, but the cycle was the same. Wake up stiff and cold. Eat food that tasted like cardboard. Wait. Always waiting either for a lawyer who barely showed up or for news that never came. George was his only constant. The older man had a way of grounding Ethan, offering small nuggets of wisdom between long stretches of silence. But despite the strange comfort of George's words, doubt clawed at Ethan like an unrelenting itch. What if no one believed him? What if this nightmare never ended? That morning, Ethan sat with his back against the cell wall, his knees pulled close to his chest. George sat across the room, idly humming some old tune Ethan did not recognize. The heavy sound of boots echoed in the hallway, and a guard appeared, his face expressionless as he barked, "Carter, your lawyer's here. Let's go." Ethan's pulse quickened. He stood quickly, brushing off his wrinkled shirt, his palms clammy with sweat. He gave George a quick glance before following the guard down the narrow hallway. "Good luck, kid," George called after him. Ethan wished he shared George's confidence. Michael Brooks looked slightly less disheveled this time, though his tie was still crooked, and his eyes were shadowed with exhaustion. He sat at a small metal table in the windowless meeting room, papers spread in front of him. "Sit down, Ethan," Michael said, motioning to the chair across from him. Ethan dropped into the chair, his heart thudding in his chest. "What's going on? Did you find anything?" Michael adjusted his glasses and exhaled sharply. "I've been working on your alibi. You said you were at work that night, right?" "Yes," Ethan replied quickly. "I was at the office. I didn't leave until almost 10. Michael nodded, shuffling through his papers. "I called your office and got in touch with your boss. They confirmed you were scheduled to work late that night. The security cameras were rolling too. I'm waiting for them to send me the footage." Ethan's heart jumped. "So that proves I wasn't near the bank." "Hold on," Michael said, raising a hand. "It's a start, but it's not a slam dunk. Hale and Norris are claiming you had an accomplice, that someone else did the robbery while you provided the getaway. The prosecution is running with that." Ethan's stomach dropped. "But that's not true." "I know," Michael replied, his voice steady, "but we need hard proof to break their story. The security footage from your office will help, but we'll need more." Ethan leaned back in his chair, the small spark of hope flickering like a candle in the wind. He ran a hand over his face, feeling the weight of it all. "What about the fingerprints? How could my prints be on that gun?" Michael frowned, as if trying to find the right words. "I don't know yet, Ethan. Fingerprints are tricky. If someone wanted to set you up, they could have lifted them off something else, something you touched, and planted them on the weapon. But proving that won't be easy." Ethan slumped forward, resting his arms on the table. "This feels impossible. How am I supposed to fight something like this?" Michael leaned back in his chair, his tone softening. "Look, I know it feels that way right now, but this isn't over. I'll get the footage and dig deeper into those officers. We'll keep fighting." The words were meant to reassure him, but Ethan could hear the cracks in Michael's voice. How many other people had sat in this same room, hearing the same promises? Hours later, Ethan was back in his cell, staring blankly at the wall. His conversation with Michael replayed in his head, each word gnawing at him. Proof. That was all they needed. But in a system where the odds were stacked against him, proof felt like some distant, unreachable thing. George sat on his bench, arms crossed, watching Ethan with quiet curiosity. "You're thinking too loud again," he said after a while. Ethan glanced up, his brow furrowed. "What?" George smirked. "You've got that look. The one where your brain won't shut off, no matter how much you want it to." Ethan sighed and leaned back against the wall. "My lawyer found something surveillance footage from my office. It should prove I wasn't near that bank." George raised an eyebrow. "That's good, isn't it?" Ethan shrugged, his voice low. "Hale and Norris are saying I had an accomplice. It's all lies, but they're twisting everything. I feel like no matter what I do, I can't win." George was quiet for a moment, his gaze steady. Then he spoke, his voice calm but firm. "You ever hear about the willow tree?" Ethan frowned. "What?" "The willow tree," George repeated. "When storms come, big oak trees snap because they're too stiff, too stubborn. But the willow bends. It bends with the wind and survives. You're in a storm, kid. You need to bend, not break." Ethan stared at him, the words settling in. "What are you saying?" George leaned forward slightly. "You keep your head down. You let them think you're breaking. And when the time comes, you hit them with the truth. They won't see it coming." Ethan nodded slowly, the flicker of hope from earlier returning, stronger this time. "I just need to hold on." "That's right," George said with a small smile. "One step at a time." The next day, something unexpected happened. Ethan was sitting in his cell, eating the kind of meal only a prison kitchen could produce, when a guard stopped outside his door. It was Officer Linda Thompson, a woman Ethan had seen a few times during his short stay. She had sharp eyes, but a softer presence than the others. "Carter," she said, her voice low, "come with me." Ethan stood cautiously, unsure of what was happening, and followed her down the hallway. Instead of leading him to another interrogation room, she stopped at a small office tucked in the corner of the station. She glanced down the hall before pushing open the door and motioning for him to step inside. The office was quiet, with blinds half drawn to block out the harsh sunlight. Officer Thompson closed the door behind them and turned to face him. "Sit down." Ethan sat, his heart pounding. "What is this about?" Thompson leaned against the desk, crossing her arms. "I know what's going on with you, Carter." Ethan blinked. "What do you mean?" "I mean," she said firmly, "that I've seen enough of Detective Hale's cases to know something doesn't add up here. He's been pulling strings and cutting corners for years, but no one's had the guts to call him on it." Ethan stared at her, barely able to process what she was saying. "You believe me?" Thompson nodded slowly. "I don't know everything yet, but I know corruption when I see it. I can't promise much, but I'm going to help where I can." "Why?" Ethan asked, his voice cracking with disbelief. Her gaze softened, and for the first time, he saw kindness in her eyes. "Because sometimes doing the right thing is the only thing that matters." Ethan felt something shift inside him, like the first hint of sunlight breaking through storm clouds. For the first time since his arrest, he wasn't completely alone. As Officer Thompson led him back to his cell, Ethan felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in days. Hope. It was fragile and uncertain, but it was there. George was waiting when he returned, as if he already knew something had changed. "You look different," George said, watching him closely. Ethan sat down, his shoulders a little straighter. "Maybe I am." George grinned, the lines on his face softening. "Good. Hold on to that, kid. The wind's starting to shift." And for the first time, Ethan believed it. Ethan sat on the cold metal bench in his cell, staring at the ceiling as Officer Linda Thompson's words played over in his mind. "Sometimes, doing the right thing is the only thing that matters." Those words settled into his chest like an anchor, heavy but steady. Someone believed him, someone inside the system. It was the smallest thread of hope, but it was enough to pull him from the edge. George, lounging in his usual spot against the wall, eyed him with quiet curiosity. "You're thinking loud again," he said with a grin, the same one he always wore when he thought he knew something Ethan did not. Ethan looked over, the corner of his mouth twitching upward. "I think someone's finally on my side." George raised an eyebrow, his grin widening. "The lady cop, huh? Thompson? She's one of the good ones." Ethan's expression sobered. "What makes you say that?" George shrugged, his tone calm. "Been in here long enough to know the ones who still have a conscience. She's not like Hale or Norris. If she's offering to help, it's because she sees something worth fighting for." Ethan let that sink in. He wanted to believe it. He needed to believe it. For days, he had been drowning, surrounded by people who either ignored his innocence or wanted him buried under lies. Linda Thompson's words were the first lifeline he had been thrown. The next morning, Ethan was pulled from his cell earlier than usual. Officer Thompson waited in the hallway, her expression unreadable. She motioned for him to follow her without a word. Ethan obeyed, his heart pounding. He had no idea what was coming next, but a flicker of hope stayed with him. She led him into the same small office they had spoken in before. This time, someone else was there, sitting at the desk. A woman mid-30s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. Her dark hair was pulled into a loose ponytail, and she wore a gray blazer over a plain white blouse. She looked up as they entered, her gaze locking on Ethan with an intensity that made him pause. "Ethan Carter?" she asked. Ethan nodded cautiously. "Yeah." She extended a hand. "Clare Jennings. I'm a private investigator. Officer Thompson told me about your situation." Ethan stared at her hand for a moment before shaking it. "A private investigator? Why would you—" He trailed off, looking between Clare and Thompson. Clare sat back in her chair, lacing her fingers together. "I've been following Detective Hale's career for a while now. Let's just say your case isn't the first time something questionable has happened under his watch." Ethan's heart raced. "What do you mean?" Clare leaned forward, her voice calm but firm. "Hale has a pattern. Convenient evidence. Confessions under pressure. He's closed a lot of cases. But when you look closely, things don't always add up." Ethan felt his chest tighten. "Why hasn't anyone stopped him?" "Because no one wants to," Clare replied. "Most people don't question a cop who gets results. Until now." She glanced at Thompson, who gave her a small nod. Ethan swallowed hard, trying to keep his voice steady. "And you believe me?" Claire's gaze was unwavering. "I do, but believing you isn't enough. We need to prove it. Thompson told me about the surveillance footage your lawyer's waiting on. That's a good start. But I'm going to dig deeper. I'm going to find the cracks in Hale's story." Ethan stared at her, a mix of disbelief and relief washing over him. It was the first time anyone outside of his lawyer had said they believed him, and this time the words felt real. Clare wasn't doing this out of obligation. She was here because she wanted to be. "Why are you helping me?" Ethan asked, his voice soft. Clare's expression shifted, a flicker of something personal crossing her face. "Years ago, my brother got caught up in something he didn't do. Wrong place, wrong time. He didn't make it out." She paused, her tone hardening. "I couldn't help him, but I can help you." Ethan's throat tightened. He nodded, the words getting caught somewhere between his chest and his lips. "Thank you," he managed finally. Clare stood, picking up a small notebook and a pen from the desk. "I need everything you can remember about the night of the arrest. Details, what Hale and Norris said, where they were, anything that felt off." Ethan's mind raced as he tried to recall every detail. "Hale barely said anything at first. He just shined his flashlight in my face and asked for my license and registration. Norris, he was the one circling my car." He opened my trunk without permission. Claire jotted notes quickly, her focus sharp. And the bag? You're sure you'd never seen it before? I swear, Ethan said firmly. I didn't even know it was there until Norris pulled it out. Claire paused, looking up. How often do you drive that car? Every day, Ethan replied, to work and back. I keep it clean. If there'd been a backpack in my trunk, I would have noticed. She nodded, making another note. Good, that'll help. Ethan watched her work, feeling a cautious optimism growing in his chest. Claire was methodical, deliberate, someone who knew how to untangle lies. It was the first time in days that he felt like there might be a way out. Back in the cell later that day, Ethan sat on his bench, deep in thought. George watched him with a knowing look. You met someone, didn't you? George asked, a hint of a smile tugging at his lips. Ethan looked up, surprised. What? George shrugged. You've got that look, like someone cracked a window and let some air in. Ethan let out a faint chuckle. Her name's Clare. She's a private investigator. Says she's going to look into Hale and Norris. George nodded approvingly. Good. Sometimes it takes someone outside the system to shine a light on the rot inside it. Ethan let that sink in. The idea that others could see what was happening gave him hope not just for himself, but for everyone Hale might have hurt. George leaned back, his voice softer now. You hold on to people like her, kid. The ones who fight for you when you can't fight for yourself. They don't come around often. Ethan nodded, his resolve strengthening. Claire and Officer Thompson were helping him, and Michael was working on his alibi. For the first time since his arrest, Ethan felt like he was no longer standing alone against the tide. But as he lay on the hard cot that night, staring up at the dark ceiling, he knew this was just the beginning. Hale and Norris wouldn't go down quietly. They were powerful men who had built their reputations on smoke and mirrors. Ethan turned on his side, his fists clenching as determination swelled within him. They think they've already won, he whispered to himself. But they haven't seen anything yet. For the first time in days, sleep came easier, and when it did, he dreamed not of the cold cell or the smirks of corrupt cops, but of the day the truth would finally set him free. In the morning, as the cell door clanged open and another day began, Ethan felt the shift deep in his bones. He had allies now, unexpected, but real. The storm around him might still be raging, but for the first time, he wasn't alone in the fight. And that made all the difference. Ethan Carter sat on the edge of his cot, his back against the wall, staring at the faint sunlight filtering through the narrow window of the holding cell. It was strange how the light outside could seem so normal when his life had been turned upside down. He had barely eaten breakfast, the stale bread and lumpy oatmeal sitting untouched on the metal tray. His thoughts were too tangled to care about food. The memory of his meeting with Claire Jennings was still fresh, her sharp, determined voice replaying in his head like a mantra. We'll find the cracks in Hale's story. Those words gave him something he hadn't felt in days. Purpose. George was watching him from the opposite bench, leaning back with his hands behind his head, as calm as ever. You look like a man about to go to war, George said, a faint smirk playing on his lips. Ethan looked up, his expression grim. Maybe I am. George chuckled softly. Good. Wars don't get won by sitting on your hands. He paused, his gaze steady. You trust that investigator lady? Ethan nodded. Yeah, she's sharp, and she's looking into Hale. She knows something's off with him. George tilted his head. Told you the wind was shifting. It's about time someone started sniffing around those two. Ethan exhaled slowly. I just hope it's enough. Later that morning, a guard appeared at Ethan's cell door, banging the bars with his baton. Carter, let's go. Your lawyer's here. Ethan stood quickly, his heart racing with a mix of anxiety and hope. As he followed the guard down the long hallway, the clanging of doors echoed around him, loud enough to make his head pound. He knew something was happening. He could feel it in his bones. Claire and Michael were digging into the cracks of Hale's lies. Maybe, just maybe, they had found something. Michael Brooks was waiting in the same cramped meeting room as before, this time with a look of restrained excitement on his face. For the first time since they'd met, he looked alive. "Sit down, Ethan," Michael said, motioning to the chair. Ethan did as he was told, his nerves prickling as Michael spread out several papers on the table. "What is it?" Ethan asked quickly. Michael leaned in, his voice low but firm. "I've got the office surveillance footage from the night of your arrest. It clearly shows you sitting at your desk until 9:45 p.m. You didn't leave the building until after the robbery had already happened." Ethan's heart leapt in his chest. "That's it. That proves I wasn't anywhere near the bank." Michael held up a hand. "It's good evidence, but it doesn't close the case yet. Hale and Norris are still claiming you were working with someone. They'll say your alibi only proves you didn't go inside the bank. But there's more." Ethan froze. "More?" Michael nodded, a smile creeping onto his tired face. "Claire found something. She got traffic camera footage from the intersection near where you were pulled over." Ethan's pulse quickened. "And?" Michael slid a printed photo across the table. Ethan picked it up, his hands trembling as he looked at it. The black and white image showed Hale and Norris standing by his car. In the corner of the frame, Officer Norris could clearly be seen holding a backpack, the same backpack they had pulled from his trunk before the trunk was ever opened. Ethan's mouth went dry. "They planted it." Michael nodded. "That's what it looks like. Claire is working on getting the raw footage admitted as evidence, but it's a start. The cracks are showing, Ethan." Ethan leaned back in his chair, his heart pounding. For the first time since this nightmare began, he could see a way out. The truth was finally clawing its way to the surface. Back in his cell, Ethan couldn't sit still. He paced the small space, his mind racing. George watched him with a raised eyebrow. "You're making me dizzy, kid," George said. Ethan stopped, running a hand through his hair. "They found traffic footage. It shows Norris holding the bag before they opened my trunk." George sat up, his eyes sharp. "Well, I'll be damned. They're slipping." Ethan let out a shaky breath. "Yeah, Claire and my lawyer think this could blow the case wide open." George grinned. "That's what happens when you build a house out of lies, Ethan. Sooner or later, it all comes crashing down." Ethan nodded slowly, his fists clenching. "I just want it to end. I want my life back." George's tone softened. "You'll get there. Just remember, it's not over until it's over. Stay sharp. They're not going down without a fight." Ethan sat down on the bench, his legs feeling weak. He knew George was right. Hale and Norris were not going to roll over and admit what they'd done. They were too used to being untouchable. If the traffic footage made it to court, they would fight harder than ever to bury him. But Ethan wasn't afraid anymore. He had spent days feeling powerless, crushed under the weight of the system. Not anymore. Now he had people fighting with him, Michael, Claire, even Officer Thompson. People who believed him. That small spark of hope had become something more. It was a fire now, burning bright inside him. The next day, Claire came to visit. She walked into the meeting room carrying a folder under her arm, her face serious but determined. "Ethan," she said as she sat across from him, "we're making progress, but things are about to get tougher." Ethan frowned. "What do you mean?" Claire placed the folder on the table and opened it, revealing several documents. "When I started digging into Hale and Norris, I found something disturbing. Your case isn't the only one." Ethan stared at her, shock settling over him. "What are you talking about?" "There are other people. People who've been arrested under suspicious circumstances. Cases where evidence just happened to appear at the right moment, or where suspects claimed they were set up, but no one listened." Ethan's chest tightened. "How long has this been going on?" Claire's expression was grim. "Years. Hale and Norris have been running unchecked for a long time. Your case might be the first chance anyone has to expose them." Ethan felt the weight of her words sink in. This was bigger than him. It wasn't just about proving his innocence anymore. It was about stopping two corrupt men from destroying more lives. "What happens next?" Ethan asked, his voice steady. Claire looked him in the eye. "We take this to court. The traffic footage, the surveillance footage, everything. But you need to be ready, Ethan. Hale and Norris won't go quietly. They'll fight back, and they'll try to discredit you any way they can." Ethan clenched his fists under the table. "Let them try." Claire nodded, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "That's the spirit." That night, as Ethan sat in his cell, he felt a strange calm settle over him. The storm wasn't over, if anything. It was only getting worse. But now, for the first time, he felt like he could weather it. George watched him, his gaze thoughtful. "You're different, kid," he said finally. Ethan looked up. "How so?" George grinned. "You've got that look, like a man who knows the truth is on his side. That's dangerous for people like Hale and Norris." Ethan smiled faintly, a small flicker of confidence in his eyes. "They think they've already won, but they don't know what's coming." George let out a low chuckle, his grin widening. "Now that's what I like to hear." As Ethan lay down on the cot that night, staring up at the dark ceiling, he felt something he hadn't felt in weeks. Certainty. He didn't know how long the fight would take, or how hard it would get. But he knew one thing for sure. The truth was on his side, and in the end, that would be enough. The courtroom was cold, quiet, and buzzing with an invisible tension as Ethan Carter was led inside. His footsteps echoed off the marble floors, too loud in his ears. It had been nearly 2 weeks since his arrest, but it felt like months. Today, his preliminary hearing was set to continue, and for the first time, Ethan felt something different. He wasn't walking into the lion's den with nothing. He had allies, evidence, and a glimmer of hope. As Ethan took his seat beside Michael Brooks, his court-appointed lawyer, he glanced around the room. Detective Robert Hale and Officer Sam Norris sat stiffly behind the prosecutor's table. Hale wore the same smug expression he always had, his confidence unshaken, while Norris avoided Ethan's gaze completely. The prosecutor, a polished woman with sharp features, stood and began her opening remarks, delivering them with a practiced authority that only deepened Ethan's sense of unease. She spoke of the overwhelming evidence against him, the planted backpack, the fingerprints on the gun, and Ethan's proximity to the area of the robbery. Ethan clenched his fists under the table, trying to steady his breathing. The lies still carried weight, and he could feel the judgmental stares of the small audience, the reporters, a few curious locals, and the clerk taking notes. They all watched him like he was already guilty. Michael leaned closer and whispered, "Stay calm. Trust me." Ethan swallowed hard, nodding, though his heart thudded so loudly he wondered if everyone else could hear it. After the prosecutor finished, Michael stood, straightening his wrinkled suit jacket. Ethan watched his lawyer carefully, holding his breath as Michael addressed the judge. "Your Honor," Michael began, his voice clear and steady, "the defense has new evidence that we believe will call into question not only the state's case against my client, but also the conduct of Detectives Hale and Norris." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Ethan saw Hale's expression tighten ever so slightly, though he kept his face blank. "Proceed," the judge said with a nod. Michael turned and motioned toward the clerk handling the AV equipment. "We'd like to enter footage from a traffic camera near the scene of the traffic stop where my client was arrested." The prosecutor shot to her feet. "Your Honor, this evidence was not provided during discovery." Michael turned calmly to face her. "It was obtained only recently by a private investigator working with the defense. We are submitting it now in the interest of presenting the full truth." The judge gave the prosecutor a hard look before nodding toward the clerk. "I'll allow it. Play the footage." Ethan's palms were slick with sweat as the video began to play on the large screen at the front of the room. The grainy black and white footage showed the corner of an intersection. Ethan's car pulled to the side of the road. It was dark, but the streetlights provided just enough visibility. Everyone watched in silence as Detective Hale and Officer Norris approached Ethan's vehicle. Hale stood by the driver's window, shining his flashlight, while Norris circled the car. The critical moment came when Norris moved to the trunk. For a split second, clear as day, the camera caught him holding a backpack in his hand before the trunk was opened. A gasp broke the silence in the courtroom. Michael paused the video and stepped toward the screen, his voice ringing with confidence. "Your Honor, as you can see, the backpack in question, the one allegedly discovered in my client's trunk, was in Officer Norris's possession before the trunk was ever opened. This directly contradicts the officer's sworn statements and calls the legitimacy of their evidence into question." Ethan glanced toward Hale and Norris. Hale's face was stone, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of panic. Norris shifted uncomfortably in his seat, suddenly unable to look anywhere but the floor. The prosecutor stood, her voice sharp but wavering. "This video is circumstantial at best. It doesn't prove anything about the contents of that bag." Michael didn't flinch. "The defense intends to show that the bag was planted along with the gun and the cash. Further, we have office surveillance footage proving my client's alibi. He was at work during the time of the robbery." The judge held up a hand, her voice firm as she addressed both sides. "I'll allow the evidence for now. This court will reconvene after reviewing the submitted footage and accompanying documentation." Her gavel struck the sound block with a heavy crack, signaling the end of the session. Ethan exhaled the breath he hadn't realized he was holding. For the first time in weeks, he felt like the tide was turning. After court, Ethan was escorted back to the holding cell, his mind racing. He slumped onto the bench, the adrenaline of the day finally catching up to him. Across the room, George watched him with a knowing smile. "You look like a man who just got his first big break," George said. Ethan nodded, his voice low but steady. "They showed the traffic footage. It proves Norris had the bag before they even opened my trunk." George let out a satisfied chuckle. "Told you they'd slip up? Men like Hale always do. They think they're untouchable until they're not." Ethan ran a hand through his hair, the weight of everything settling on him. "It's not over yet, but it's something." George leaned forward, his expression serious now. "Listen, kid, when the truth starts coming out, people like Hale are going to fight dirtier than ever. They're going to throw everything they've got at you. You ready for that?" Ethan looked up, meeting George's gaze. For the first time since his arrest, his voice didn't waver. "Yeah, I'm ready." George nodded approvingly, leaning back again. "Good. Hold on to that fire. You're going to need it." That night, as Ethan lay on the hard cot, staring at the dark ceiling, his mind refused to rest. The cracks in Hale and Norris's case were showing, but he knew George was right. This wasn't over. If anything, the storm was only just beginning. He thought about Clare, her unwavering belief in his innocence, and her determination to find the truth. He thought about Officer Thompson, risking her position to help him. They were fighting for him, even when he had nearly given up on himself. Ethan's thoughts turned to Hale and Norris, the weight of their lies pressing on him like a stone. How many others had they done this to? How many people had been buried under fabricated evidence and false charges because no one was there to believe them? His jaw tightened. This isn't just about me anymore, he realized. If he could expose them, if he could prove the truth, then maybe he could stop them from destroying someone else's life. For the first time in days, Ethan felt like he had a purpose beyond survival. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for everyone like him, people who didn't have a voice, people the system had failed. He closed his eyes, a steady calm settling over him. The fight wasn't over, but he wasn't afraid anymore. The truth was on his side, and no matter how hard Hale and Norris tried to bury it, he would see it through to the end. Ethan whispered into the dark, his voice filled with quiet determination. They don't get to win this time. And for the first time, he believed it. Ethan Carter awoke the next morning feeling the difference in his bones. It was subtle but real, like the weight of the walls pressing down on him had lifted slightly. He wasn't free yet, but for the first time since his arrest, the truth was finally scratching its way to the surface. He sat up on the narrow cot and glanced across the cell to George, who was watching him with an unreadable expression. "You look like a man with hope in his pocket," George said with a slight grin, his voice still hoarse from age and too many cigarettes. Ethan stretched his stiff neck. "It's not over, but I think we've got them rattled." George tilted his head, his grin fading. "You're not wrong, kid, but rattled dogs bite the hardest. You be careful now. People like Hale don't go down easy." Ethan nodded slowly, George's words settling into the back of his mind. He knew the fight was far from finished. Hale and Norris had spent years building their reputations, and they wouldn't let it all crumble without a fight. Later that morning, the guard led Ethan to the meeting room, where Michael Brooks and Clare Jennings were waiting. Clare had her usual sharp focus, her notebook already open, pen tapping rhythmically against its spine. Michael looked better too, less like a man who had already lost, and more like someone with a fighting chance. "Sit down, Ethan," Michael said as Ethan entered. Ethan lowered himself into the cold chair, his hands clasped together on the table. "What's going on?" Clare leaned forward, her gaze intense. "We've got momentum now. That traffic footage shook them, but we need more. Michael and I have been digging into old cases connected to Hale and Norris." Ethan frowned. "Old cases?" Clare nodded, flipping open her notebook. "There's a pattern, one we couldn't ignore. In the last 5 years, Hale and Norris have been involved in several arrests where evidence seemed to appear at just the right moment to close the case." Michael took over, holding up a stack of files. "We're talking about fingerprints conveniently found, evidence discovered during vehicle searches. Sound familiar?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "So, this isn't just me." "Not by a long shot," Clare replied. "The problem is, no one ever questioned them. These people, some pleaded guilty to avoid heavier sentences. Others were convicted because they didn't have the resources to fight back." Ethan felt his stomach turn. He thought about the other faces he had seen in holding cells, the hopeless looks in their eyes. How many lives had Hale and Norris ruined? "What happens now?" Ethan asked, his voice low. Michael exhaled sharply. "Claire's digging into 2 of those cases where she thinks we can prove Hale tampered with evidence. If we can show a pattern of misconduct, it'll weaken the prosecution's case against you." Clare nodded. "But here's the thing, Ethan, this isn't just about proving your innocence anymore. If we expose them, this could become much bigger." Ethan sat back, his heart thudding in his chest. He had known for days now that this fight was bigger than him, but hearing it said out loud made it feel more real. He thought about Hale, how smug he looked in court, how confident he had been when framing Ethan for something he didn't do. "How long will it take?" Ethan asked finally. Clare exchanged a look with Michael before replying. "Not long. I've already got 2 former defendants willing to speak out. One was a young guy like you, wrong place, wrong time. The other spent 3 years in prison before his charges were overturned. Both say Hale was involved." Michael added, "We're filing motions to bring this new evidence into the court record. Once we get it in front of the judge, things are going to move quickly." Ethan nodded, a slow breath escaping his lips. "Thank you," he said, his voice filled with quiet resolve. Clare smiled faintly. "Don't thank us yet. Hale isn't going to roll over. Be ready for them to hit back." The next court date came sooner than Ethan expected. As he was led into the courtroom, he felt the tension buzzing in the air. The rows of benches were fuller this time. More reporters, more curious faces. The weight of their stares pressed on him, but he kept his head up. Hale and Norris sat across the room, their confidence now laced with something sharper unease. Hale's jaw was set tight, his eyes darting toward Ethan for just a moment before he looked away. Norris sat beside him, shoulders stiff, eyes fixed on the table. The judge entered, and the room settled into silence. Michael stood first, his voice clear and steady. Your Honor, the defense requests to enter new evidence that directly impacts the credibility of the arresting officers in this case. Specifically, we've uncovered a pattern of misconduct involving Detectives Hale and Norris. The prosecutor stood quickly. Objection, Your Honor. These claims are irrelevant to the current charges. The judge held up a hand. Sit down, counselor. I'll hear what the defense has to say. Michael nodded gratefully and turned toward the clerk, who began playing a series of short clips and showing documents on the courtroom screen. First was the footage of Norris holding the backpack before Ethan's trunk was opened. Then came interview statements from the two former defendants Clare had found. Both described eerily similar scenarios: pulled over without reason, evidence found in their vehicles, and pressure to confess to crimes they didn't commit. Ethan watched as the room shifted. Whispers broke out among the spectators. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notepads, and even the judge leaned forward slightly, her expression growing sharper with every piece of evidence. Michael delivered the final blow. Your Honor, the defense asserts that Detectives Hale and Norris have engaged in a pattern of planting evidence to secure arrests and convictions. This new information calls into question not only the validity of my client's arrest, but also the prosecution's entire case. The courtroom fell silent as the judge sat back in her chair, her expression unreadable. The prosecutor stood, her voice strained. Your Honor, these claims are unproven. We maintain that the evidence against the defendant is legitimate. The judge's gaze turned cold as she looked over at Hale and Norris. I'll decide what is legitimate. I'm ordering an internal review of this case and the officers involved. Until that review is complete, I'm releasing Mr. Carter on his own recognizance. Ethan's breath caught. He turned to Michael, who gave him the faintest smile. The gavel struck, and the sound echoed through the room like thunder. When Ethan stepped out of the courthouse later that afternoon, the world felt different. The air was crisper, the sunlight warmer, and for the first time in weeks, he felt like he could breathe. Reporters swarmed him, their voices overlapping as they threw questions his way. How does it feel to be released? What will you do now? Ethan glanced at Michael, who nodded toward the waiting car. Ignoring the shouts, Ethan paused just long enough to say, "The truth always comes out. It's just a matter of time." Claire was waiting near the curb, leaning against her car with her arms crossed and a small smile on her face. "Not bad, Carter," she said, as Ethan approached. Ethan smiled faintly. "It's not over yet, is it?" Claire shook her head. "No, but it's starting to fall apart for them. And you're free. That's a win." Ethan looked up at the sky, feeling the sun on his face. For the first time in weeks, he felt hope not just for himself, but for everyone Hale and Norris had hurt. "They'll get what's coming to them," Ethan said quietly. Claire nodded. "Yeah, they will." And as Ethan climbed into the car, leaving the courthouse and the nightmare behind, he allowed himself a moment of peace. The fight wasn't over, but for now, the cracks in the wall were showing, and the truth was finally breaking free. Ethan Carter woke up in his own bed for the first time in weeks. The thin light of morning filtered through the curtains, painting soft streaks across the plain beige walls of his small apartment. For a moment, as he lay staring at the ceiling, he could almost convince himself the last few weeks had been a bad dream. The cold metal bench, the suffocating walls of the cell, Hale's smug smirk. It all felt distant now, like echoes from another life. But the moment didn't last. His phone buzzed on the nightstand, jolting him back to reality. The world hadn't stopped moving just because he had been released. The fight wasn't over. He sat up, ran a hand through his unkempt hair, and grabbed the phone. It was a text from Claire Jennings. "Court resumes today. Be ready. Hale and Norris are getting desperate." Ethan exhaled slowly, his heart already pounding. He knew she was right. They were running out of time, and when cornered, men like Hale and Norris didn't surrender. They fought back harder. The courthouse buzzed with activity when Ethan arrived. reporters lingering like vultures near the steps. Claire was waiting for him at the entrance, sharp as always, her gray blazer crisp and her expression unreadable. She gave him a quick nod as he approached. "You okay?" she asked. Ethan shrugged. "As okay as I can be." Claire smiled faintly. "You're tougher than you look, Carter. Just stick to the truth. Today's going to be rough, but we're ready." He nodded, following her into the building. The weight of what was happening settled in his chest as he walked through the halls. People turned to stare, some whispering, others pointing. His name was everywhere: news reports, headlines, conversations. Ethan Carter, falsely accused. And across all of it were the faces of Detective Robert Hale and Officer Sam Norris, men who had built careers off manipulation, who had walked into his life and flipped it upside down with a planted bag and a lie. The courtroom was packed when they entered. The gallery overflowed with reporters, spectators, and Ethan's co-workers from the office faces he hadn't seen since his arrest. It was strange to see them sitting there, staring at him with curiosity instead of judgment. Michael Brooks sat next to him, his face unusually confident. Claire took a seat a few rows back, her notebook open and ready. Across the room, Hale and Norris sat stiff-backed, their faces stony, though Ethan could see the tension in their eyes. Hale looked like a man balancing on the edge of a crumbling cliff, his calm facade held together by sheer willpower. The judge entered, and the court fell silent. The prosecutor, who had spent days painting Ethan as a criminal mastermind, stood first. But this time, her voice carried a nervous edge as she tried to hold her case together. She clung to the same evidence: fingerprints, the backpack, the traffic stop, but now every argument felt weaker, weighed down by the traffic footage and witness statements Claire had dug up. Michael stood when it was his turn, his voice steady and clear as he began. "Your Honor, the defense has demonstrated repeated misconduct by the arresting officers in this case. The traffic camera footage clearly shows Officer Norris holding the backpack before the trunk was opened, contradicting their sworn statements." He paused, letting the words settle over the room before continuing. "And now, we're prepared to call witnesses who can speak to a pattern of similar misconduct in previous cases where Detective Hale and Officer Norris manipulated evidence to secure convictions." The prosecutor shot to her feet. "Objection, Your Honor. These claims are unfounded." The judge's gavel struck sharply. "Overruled. I'll hear what the defense has to say." Ethan watched as Michael called the first witness, a middle-aged man named Stephen Ramos, who had spent 3 years in prison after a traffic stop eerily similar to Ethan's. Stephen sat at the witness stand, his hands gripping the sides as he described how Hale had discovered a bag of drugs in his car that he swore had never been there. "I told everyone I was innocent," Stephen said, his voice cracking slightly. "But no one listened. I didn't have proof, and they didn't believe me." The second witness, Eric Thompson, was younger, no older than 25. He described being pulled over late one night and pressured into confessing to a crime he didn't commit after Hale and Norris threatened him with heavier charges. Both men's stories mirrored Ethan's too closely to ignore. The courtroom grew heavy with silence as the witnesses finished. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks, and even the prosecutor seemed to sink slightly, as if the weight of the case had shifted against her. Michael stood once more, his voice calm but firm. "Your Honor, these witnesses and the evidence presented demonstrate a clear pattern of corruption and misconduct by Detectives Hale and Norris. The defense moves to dismiss all charges against my client, Ethan Carter, on the grounds of a wrongful arrest." Ethan sat frozen as the judge looked over her notes, her expression unreadable. Every second dragged on, and the silence in the room was suffocating. Finally, the judge looked up. "The evidence presented by the defense raises serious questions about the conduct of the officers involved in this case. I have no choice but to order an immediate dismissal of all charges against Ethan Carter." The sound of the gavel struck like thunder, ringing in Ethan's ears. Ethan's heart raced as he stood, his legs weak beneath him. He turned to Michael, who gave him a rare, genuine smile. Claire was already on her feet a few rows back, a triumphant glint in her eyes. Reporters erupted with questions, their voices overlapping in a frantic chorus, but Ethan barely heard them. He was free. The truth had won. As he exited the courthouse, sunlight hit his face like a wave of warmth he hadn't felt in weeks. He inhaled deeply, the air sweeter than it had ever been. Claire joined him on the steps, her notebook tucked under her arm. "Well, you did it," she said, a smile tugging at her lips. "Hale and Norris aren't walking away from this one." "What happens to them now?" Ethan asked, his voice steady. Claire's expression grew serious. "An internal investigation will tear through everything they've done. Other cases will come up, and people will start asking questions. They're finished." Ethan nodded, letting the words wash over him. He turned his gaze to the crowd of reporters waiting near the steps, their cameras pointed at him. Someone shouted, "How does it feel to be free?" Ethan paused, choosing his words carefully. "It feels like justice, not just for me, but for everyone they've hurt. This stops here." Claire clapped a hand on his shoulder, her voice quiet but firm. "You're stronger than you think, Carter. Don't forget that." Ethan nodded, his chest swelling with something he hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. That evening, back in his apartment, Ethan stood by the window, watching the sunset bleed across the horizon in streaks of orange and gold. His phone buzzed beside him, but he let it go. For now, he didn't need the noise, the questions, or the attention. He needed the silence, the stillness of knowing that the nightmare was over. A knock on the door startled him. He opened it to find Michael and Claire standing there, takeaway coffee cups in hand. "We figured you might need company," Claire said with a smirk, handing him a cup. Ethan smiled faintly, stepping aside to let them in. As they sat on his plain couch, talking about everything and nothing, Ethan realized something. He had walked through fire, and he had survived not because he was strong on his own, but because people had believed in him when he couldn't believe in himself. George's voice echoed in his mind. "Sometimes a little kindness is all it takes to get through the worst of it." He looked at Claire and Michael, gratitude swelling in his chest. "Thank you," he said simply. Claire raised her coffee cup with a grin. "To justice." Ethan smiled, the weight of the last few weeks finally lifting for good. "To hope," he replied. Outside, the sun dipped below the horizon, and for the first time in a long time, Ethan felt whole again. Ethan Carter sat at his small kitchen table, staring into a steaming cup of coffee as the sunlight poured through his apartment window. The morning felt unreal, quiet, calm, and completely his own. A far cry from the suffocating cell walls and the relentless buzz of the courthouse. He wrapped his hands around the cup and let the warmth settle into his fingers, a small comfort in the midst of everything. The past few days had been a blur. After the charges were dropped and the truth came to light, Ethan's story spread like wildfire. News outlets called him a symbol of resilience, while Detective Hale and Officer Norris found themselves at the center of a growing storm. An internal investigation had been launched, digging into years of suspicious arrests and planted evidence. Ethan had seen their names in the headlines, detectives under scrutiny for misconduct. For the first time in weeks, Ethan was free, truly free. But the aftermath lingered. His phone had not stopped buzzing. Friends, colleagues, and even strangers wanted to hear his side of the story. Reporters camped outside the courthouse and sometimes his building, hoping for a quote. He had given one brief statement, a quiet declaration that the truth had won and that corruption could not go unchecked. After that, he shut the world out. He needed space to breathe. There was another knock at the door, 3 short taps. Ethan already knew who it was. He pulled it open to find Claire Jennings standing there, a cardboard tray of coffees balanced in one hand and a paper bag in the other. You didn't answer my texts, she said with mock annoyance, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. So, I figured I'd come check on you. Ethan couldn't help but smile. I didn't realize private investigators did wellness checks. Just for my favorite clients, Claire replied, handing him a coffee. You look better. Less like a ghost. Ethan shrugged, shutting the door behind her. I'm getting there. He motioned toward the kitchen table, where she dropped the paper bag and took a seat across from him. Eat breakfast, Claire said, pulling out 2 greasy-looking breakfast sandwiches. Thought you might need something more substantial than whatever you've been eating. Ethan smirked. You really do have a knack for showing up at the right time. Claire took a sip of her coffee, her expression softening as she looked at him. It's going to take time, Ethan. You've been through hell. Don't expect it to disappear overnight. Ethan stared into his coffee cup, her words settling into him. It's weird, he said finally. I spent so much time just trying to survive, just trying to prove I wasn't crazy, that now that it's over, I don't know what to do. Claire nodded, her gaze thoughtful. You've been fighting so hard that stopping feels unnatural. That's normal, but you'll figure it out. Ethan looked up at her, curiosity flickering in his eyes. How do you know all this? You sound like you've been through it yourself. Claire hesitated, then offered a small smile. Life has a way of throwing punches, Carter. You learn to roll with them, or you go down swinging. Either way, you keep moving. Ethan nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Claire was right. Life wasn't going to stop. Not for him. That afternoon, Ethan decided it was time to step outside. He stuffed his hands into the pockets of his jacket as he walked down the cracked sidewalk of his quiet neighborhood. The world felt sharper somehow, clearer, as if the gray fog that had weighed him down for weeks had finally lifted. As he turned the corner, he saw an old man sitting on a park bench, hunched over with his head bowed. For a second, Ethan's heart skipped, because the man reminded him of George. He hadn't seen George since the day he left the holding cell. He had asked Claire if she could check on him, but jails were tough places to get answers. Mind if I sit here? Ethan asked as he approached the bench. The old man looked up, startled, but nodded, and motioned to the empty spot beside him. Ethan sat down, the bench creaking beneath them. You look like you're carrying the world, the man said, his voice rough, though softer than George's. Ethan smiled faintly, staring at the line of trees in front of them. I just put it down, actually. The man gave him a look, a hint of curiosity in his eyes. Ethan let the silence hang for a moment, the breeze rustling through the branches above. You know, Ethan said softly, sometimes people show up in your life when you least expect it, and they change everything. The man grunted, but there was warmth in the sound. Lucky you, then. Not everyone gets that. Ethan nodded. Yeah, I was lucky. He thought about George, about Claire, about Officer Linda Thompson, all the people who had stepped in when he felt completely alone. The kindness they'd shown him had been a lifeline when he was sinking. Without them, the truth might have stayed buried. 2 days later, Ethan found himself standing outside a run-down diner on the edge of town. The sign above the door buzzed faintly, one of the letters flickering in and out. He pushed the door open, the bell jingling above him, and stepped inside. George Harris sat at a booth in the back, nursing a cup of coffee. His beard looked a little whiter, his denim jackets a little more frayed, but his face lit up when he saw Ethan. Well, look who decided to show up, George said with a grin, as Ethan slid into the booth across from him. Ethan smiled back. I owe you a thank you. George raised an eyebrow. For what? For talking sense into me, Ethan replied. For telling me to hold on when I was ready to give up. George waved a hand dismissively, but there was a spark of pride in his eyes. You did that yourself, kid. I just pointed you in the right direction. Ethan shook his head. You did more than that. Sometimes, a little kindness is the difference between sinking and swimming. George looked at him for a long moment before nodding. Well, "You swam, kid. And you made it." They sat in silence for a while after that, the only sounds the faint hum of conversation and the clatter of plates from the kitchen. Ethan sipped his coffee, a sense of peace settling over him. "So, what now?" George asked finally, his eyes twinkling with curiosity. Ethan looked out the window at the busy street beyond, cars passing by, people walking in the sunshine. "I don't know yet, but I think I want to help people. People like me who don't have a voice." George smiled, a genuine toothy grin that softened the lines on his face. "That's not a bad idea, kid. The world needs more people like that." Ethan nodded, the certainty settling into him. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing. He wouldn't let what had happened to him happen to anyone else. That night, Ethan stood on his apartment balcony, staring up at the stars. The city stretched out below him, full of noise and life. But up here, it was quiet. He took a deep breath and let it out slowly, feeling lighter than he had in years. His phone buzzed with a message from Clare. "New start, Carter. Proud of you." Ethan smiled faintly as he slipped the phone back into his pocket. He looked out at the night sky and whispered to himself, "It's not over, but I'm ready." The world had broken him, tested him, and tried to bury him, but he had survived. More than that, he had come out stronger, carried forward by unexpected kindness, resilience, and hope. And now, as the city lights glowed in the distance, Ethan Carter was ready to begin again. As the sun set on Ethan's journey, the message was clear. Life is unpredictable, and challenges can come when you least expect them. But with resilience, unexpected kindness, and the courage to fight for the truth, even the darkest situations can lead to new beginnings. Ethan's story reminds us that hope is never truly lost, and that justice, though slow, always has a way of shining through. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales of perseverance, hope, and redemption, make sure to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on more inspiring stories just like this one. Thank you for being part of this journey, and remember, no matter how tough life gets, keep going. The next chapter might just change everything. Subscribe now, and we'll see you in the next story.